All right, so now we're going to take a look at drop-down menus and radio buttons. And these are fairly similar. Mainly the difference is just how they're displayed to the user, but the options and how they're used are pretty similar. So again, I'm going to go over to our applet setup and we're going to create another prompt. And we'll do the same thing, we'll just use some different inputs here that we've used in prior videos. And again, so I'm going to create a test prompt. And again, if we forget where any of these instructions are, we can hover over this question mark. And if you recall, so here's where our different types are. So you'll see that what we're going to do on this lesson is we're going to take a look at our drop-down. So we'll be getting into this double line logic on how we actually create our drop-down different options. Which is the same thing as how the radio button works. And there's also a meta value that does something interesting for these two options that we'll talk about as well. All right, so let's take a look at this. So again, we're going to say, tell me a joke about a cat. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we are going to add options for our joke and our cat. So we'll start our creating our variable, and we will say for this we'll define our category as input type. We are going to make this a drop down, and now we're going to add our options. Okay, so let's see. So we are going to say we could ask for a story. And I use this double line to then divide out my next option. So the colon moves me to the next input, or the next kind of parameter of the variable, and the double line is the next option. So I'm going to say story. I will say joke, and I'll say poem. Okay, so those will be our two options. Or three options, sorry. And then we're going to do, again, we'll do animal. And this time, instead of a drop down, we will do radio buttons, and that input type is radio. And then we're going to go into the different types of animals. So we will say cat, mouse, dog. Okay, great. Now remember, there's a couple other things we can do here. If we wanted to set a default for maybe mouse, I could add a star in front of that, and that will make that the default option. I won't do that, but just remember we've covered that in a prior lesson. Now there's some other things too I can do. I can add the term other to either one of these. I'll actually add it to both so we can see what it does. And what that will allow me to do is when the user selects other, the user will actually be given an empty input box where they can add their own options. So you'll see what that does. Now the meta value for these actually does something kind of interesting. So let's say we want to present the user with story. So we want to give them that option, but we want to actually tell the large language model or the AI, we want to tell the AI something different. So we want to give the user a certain thing to select, but we want to tell the user that they can select something else. Well, what we can do, we can add another colon, double colon, to get us into the meta values, and now we can define our meta properties. So if instead of story, I want like frightening story, for some reason. So let's say I want the user to select story, but I'm going to tell the LLM to make a frightening story. And then instead of just selecting joke, I'll say funny joke. What other kind of joke is there? Or how about we say this? Maybe we say dark joke. Maybe we're going to theme this. And then we've got poem, and I'll say scary poem. Okay, so now the user is not selecting. I'm a terrible typist. Scary poem, and then again we'll add our other option. Great. Okay, so The user is not actually going to see it saying scary story, but when they select story, the LLM will be told scary story. We'll see how that works. So again, we'll select an icon and we'll save it. Our applet's saved. We can go back to our front end, and now when we launch it, you'll see we've got two inputs again. We've got tell me a input type about a animal. And we've got our couple of options here. We've got story, joke, and poem, and other. So you'll see when I select other, what actually happens is I get a checkbox, or I get an open box where I can input a value. I'll select poem just so you can see what happens when we select that and we actually get a different input type than what I've selected. You'll see when I select other, again, the same thing happens with our animal. I'll select cat, and when we process that, what you'll see is what the LLM was told is tell me a scary poem about a cat, even though the user just saw poem. So again, we had that replacement variable that happened with our meta properties. All right, so that's how drop-downs and radio buttons work.